British illustrator Alfred Garth Jones isn't the first unsung hero I'd never previously heard of, but is the only one who was born just a few miles away in my hometown. How I could have got this old without knowing about him is completely baffling to me. Jones was born in 1872 in Manchester, and at the age of 18 he enrolled at Manchester Art School. A couple of years later he moved to London and continued to study art there, and also spent some time at the Académie Julian in Paris. He returned to London in 1894 at the age of 22, and his first commissions for book illustration began soon after. With a growing reputation for his visual interpretations of works of literature, he produced a series of suitably atmospheric pen and ink illustrations for the poems of John Milton in 1898. At this stage of his career, Jones was exclusively a monochrome illustrator, and he was highly skilled with pen and ink, using careful hatching techniques to solidify his images and direct the viewer's eye. Some of the illustrations had spot colour added at printing, but it was at best incidental. He also created quite a lot of work using traditional wood engraving, but I for one struggle to tell which is which with any certainty. In the following year, French author Jérôme Doucet commissioned him to illustrate his book Contes de la Fileuse. This set of images in particular was recognised as being vital to the book's success, and its French publication spread Jones's reputation in much of continental Europe too. In 1901 he was chosen to illustrate the English language edition of the verse collection A Real Queen's Fairy Book, written by Carmen Silva, the pseudonym of the Queen of Romania. And in the same year he produced a volume of appropriately melancholic but aesthetically beautiful illustrations for In Memoriam by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Like quite a few illustrators of his time, Jones worked in other areas of expression, and he was invited to design the stained glass windows for the new Cardiff City Hall, which was completed in 1906. He also created book jacket designs for books such as Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, but rather oddly not the interior page illustrations. Quite a lot of Jones's illustrated books were published in America, and this brought him to the attention of an even bigger audience. His illustrations for Henry Van Dyke's short stories The Half-Told Tales were serialised in Scribner's magazine, and they were subsequently published again in book form at the end of 1912. Although the evidence strongly suggests that the commercial demand for his work declined in the years after World War I, Jones continued to paint, mostly in the form of strikingly distinctive watercolours with romantic historical themes. It isn't clear what some of these were for, but some look as if they were for illustrated books, and a couple are obviously ex-libris book plates for wealthy clients. These are dated and reveal that he was creatively active into his 70s. Alfred Garth Jones died in 1955 at the age of 83, and sadly it seems his legacy was buried with him. In Czechoslovakia, the illustrator, artist and writer Josef Lada isn't unsung at all. There's a museum in the town of his birth, a dedicated website, and his work still sells in large numbers. But outside his home country he doesn't seem to have made the slightest impression. He was born in 1887 in the region known as Bohemia, and at the age of 14 travelled to Prague to become an apprentice bookbinder. But he also found some work as an illustrator for magazines, which encouraged him to take drawing lessons at Prague's School of Applied Arts. In 1909, at the age of only 22, Lada took up the offer of a full-time job as editor of the comedy magazine Karikatury. 2 years later, his first picture book, My Alphabet, was published, and it was so successful it has since been republished 23 times. And although he continued to create illustrations for magazines and newspapers, from this point on it was book illustration which became his almost exclusive focus. Lada was one of the earliest illustrators to realise that simplicity made images more appealing and understandable to young children. His ink lines were heavy, reminiscent of woodcuts, and his colour was applied fairly casually, using both watercolour and gouache. And using this very basic but demonstratively successful formula in all his books, he quickly became Czechoslovakia's most popular illustrator. In the mid-1920s, he began working on a series of 500 illustrations for the story The Fate of Good Soldiers Fake by Jaroslav Hasek. For some reason, this project was never completed, although a colour version was eventually published after Lada's death. But many other projects were completed and published, such as the 2-volume story Mikesh, The Adventures of the Talking Cat, which was published in 1935 and 1936. Lada's success and popularity continued to grow throughout the 1930s, up to the German occupation of Czechoslovakia in World War II. During this time he couldn't work and was forced to sell much of his original artwork to private collectors in order to have any income. And during the bombing of Prague in 1945, his daughter Eva was killed. In 1948 he published his book of absurd rhymes, Kalamajka, and this collection quickly came to be regarded as one of his finest. All Lada's illustrations for this book are gleefully surreal and bring to mind the humour of Edward Lear a century earlier. In the 1950s, his publishers asked Lada to hand-colour some of his earlier monochromes to encourage sales to a new generation of parents and children, and the strategy was immensely successful. His last published work was a volume of Czech fairy tales, and with a career of more than half a century behind him, Josef Lada died in 1957 at the age of 70. American illustrator Neysa McMein wasn't the only female realist painter of her time, but she was one of very few and arguably the most technically accomplished. She was born in Illinois in 1889, and in her youth she showed a talent for art, music and acting. She studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, and her first job was as a designer of women's hats. But in 1911 she quit her job and left for New York, where she worked as an actress and enrolled at the Art Students League in 1914. By this time McMein had already had some of her work published in magazines, but nothing at a national level, until 1915, when she sold her first illustration for a cover of the Saturday Evening Post. This was the exposure she needed to kickstart her career, and as well as more commissions for the Post, other magazines were keen to have her create similar images for them. And alongside the deluge of commissions, she also found time to illustrate several posters to aid the American war effort. In 1918 she even travelled to the war zones in France, entertaining the troops with lightning sketches and cartoons to boost morale. After the war ended, McMeин's success continued undiminished, with yet more covers and articles for the Post and the other magazines. At this time she entered into her most enduring professional relationship with McCall's magazine, and she went on to create every one of their covers between 1923 and 1937. Naturally enough, as a realistic painter, she chose to work mainly in oils, but she used pastels too, and although on occasion her work was reproduced in black and white, the illustrations were still rendered tonally. The only evidence of McMein using line art was her collaboration on an ill-fated comic strip, Deathless Deer, which began in 1942 and lasted less than a year. Her popularity in magazines led inevitably to her being in demand for advertising work, and she created the fictional housewife Betty Crocker in 1936. She also worked on other ad campaigns for major clients, including Cadillac cars and Lucky Strike cigarettes. By the end of the Second World War, McMein had become extremely wealthy and quite the celebrity. She and her husband threw many glamorous, some said decadent, parties for her fellow sophisticates from the arts and entertainment world. By the mid-1940s, magazines were increasingly using photography. so McMein began painting portraits of wealthy subjects in both pastels and oils. But all this came to an abrupt end in the later 1940s when she was diagnosed with cancer, and she died in 1949 at the age of 60. Edmond Francois Calvo was featured briefly in my series on French illustration, but he's another illustrator who deserves a closer look. Born in 1892 in Elbeuf in northern France, Calvo enlisted in the French army when the Great War began at the age of 22 and managed to emerge alive 4 years later. After the war, he held down a long list of other jobs, and his longest lasting employment was as a rural innkeeper and bartender. He did have a few cartoons published during this time, but it was almost 2 decades later in 1938 before he gave up other work and started making his living as a freelance illustrator. By this time he was already 46 years old. But he began working on a regular basis for several French children's magazines, and his cheerful and accessible cartoons quickly gained in popularity. Only a year later the Second World War began, but Calvo's age disqualified him from joining the army, and when Germany invaded and occupied France, the German authorities considered him to be no threat and allowed him to continue working. So he carried on entertaining children with his cheerful, brightly coloured work, including 1943's Un chasseur sachant chasser, a comic book retelling of the Baron Munchausen fantasy story. What the Germans didn't know was that he had also started work on La Bête est morte in 1942, but given its volatile subject, the project was sensibly kept secret until France was liberated from German occupation in 1944. La Bête est morte was written by Victor Dansette and Jacques Zimmerman, and it was a rather disturbing account of the war as a children's picture book, with different nationalities visualized as particular breeds of animal. Calvo's painstaking comic illustrations were presented in a wide range of layouts, giving this picture book immense appeal. Its success was apparently enough to persuade Disney Studios to offer him a job, but he declined, preferring to stay in his own country. All Calvo's work, whether monochrome or colour, was created with careful use of pen and ink. Occasionally colour was added at printing, but more usually Calvo painted washes of varying complexity on top of the ink line. The years after the Second World War were a prolific period for him. He published 2 books in his Patamousse series in 1946, and in the same year his story Rosalie the Car was published. This book featured particularly well executed anthropomorphic vehicles and other machines, and once again the images were presented in a wide range of layouts and formats. At this stage his narrative powers were at their strongest, and he finished the decade on a particular high note with a gloriously slapstick, vibrantly coloured series of illustrations for a retelling of the story of the comical Spanish hero Don Quixote. Calvo's last project was the comic strip series Moustache et Trottinette, which ran from 1952, and he was still working on it when he died in Paris in 1957 at the age of 65. And that's it for now, so I hope I'll see you next time.